Hey everyone, this is Pete. When I was growing up, the Atari ST was an important part of our household. Not only was it useful for practical purposes such as word processing, desktop publishing and other productivity software, it also had a solid library of games to draw upon. In fact, the Atari ST was one of our family's main gaming platforms for many years prior to our first real contact with games consoles. At various points during the ST's lifespan, my brother, my father and I all contributed software reviews to a magazine called Page 6, which later became known as New Atari User after merging with its main British rival. Because of that, we found ourselves receiving a steady stream of software that we didn't have to pay for, and as such, it was pretty rare that we'd actually spend our own money on new ST software, particularly games. That didn't stop me from pining after certain titles that I saw in ST gaming magazines though. While I certainly didn't begrudge the vast library of review copies we built up over the years, which were all fully packaged versions back in the day since digital downloads didn't exist, there were certain games that I always wanted to play, but never got the chance to. Well, I figured with the ST's back catalogue so readily accessible today, and leaving aside any discussion over the morality of the reasons that said back catalogue is so readily accessible today, it was high time I gave some of those games I always wanted to try a proper go. I'm not judging any of the titles we're looking at by today's standards. Instead, bearing the ST's capabilities and limitations in mind, I want to look at these games through the eyes of myself as a child growing up with the ST as one of our main gaming systems. Was I right to pine over these games? Or would I have been disappointed if I'd actually added them to our collection? First released in 1990 by Gremlin and programmed by Colin Fungus the Bogeyman Dooley, Toyota Celica GT Rally is a game that caught my attention for several key reasons. Firstly, it was a racing game that unfolded from a first-person perspective cockpit view. As a kid, I was too young to drive, but I was fascinated by the prospect of piloting all manner of vehicles, ranging from extravagant spaceships to the humble family Ford Granada. As such, anytime a game appeared that provided the opportunity to simulate the experience of sitting in a cockpit and pretending to really be in charge of a vehicle, I was enamoured with it. Secondly, I was fascinated by the inclusion of weather effects in this game, and the fact that you had a dedicated button to turn your windscreen wipers on. Thirdly, the game had a stripy sky. I like stripy skies. I don't really know why, I just did. I thought they looked cool. Reviews were solid at the time. Even the typically rather stingy ST format gave it a rating of 79%, noting that, while it's not super fast, the feel is excellent and you can't help holding on for dear life as you thunder around the track. Touches like the windscreen wipers and the co-driver reinforce the impression of being there. If you can't afford the 80 grand or so it costs for a rally car, this is the next best thing, possibly. Spending some time with Toyota Celica GT Rally today reveals a pretty solid first-person racer that works well within the constraints of the Atari ST's capabilities. The polygonal racecourses may look fairly simplistic by modern standards, but when combined with the sprite-based trackside scenery, they provide a good sense of occupying a space in a 3D world, and would have certainly been more than convincing enough to satisfy me as a young kid. The controls are pretty good too. While the game can be played with mouse or joystick, the former is an infinitely better choice owing to the way it allows quasi-analog steering. And what is particularly admirable about Toyota Celica GT Rally is that although the frame rate of the 3D window is somewhat variable according to how much is going on at any given time, the controls always remain completely responsive to your inputs, making it feel like you're always completely in charge of the vehicle. The handling isn't the slightest bit realistic, but I wouldn't have known that as a kid. I would have enjoyed the feeling of throwing this virtual car around corners, turning on the wipers when it was raining, and just generally enjoying the feeling that I was getting as close as it was possible to get to real driving on the Atari ST. One interesting feature that Toyota Celica GT Rally adds to the mix is the opportunity to prep your co-driver before each race begins. While by default he will call out the direction of each corner as it approaches, by customising his contribution to one segment of track at a time, you can get him to be much more precise with his instructions, or deliberately make things more difficult for yourself if you so desire. Complement this with the option to reverse the steering controls, a feature supposedly added at the suggestion of games journalists who tried a pre-release version of the game, and you can really give yourself an unnecessarily challenging time if you find the base difficulty too straightforward. The game features rally events in England, Mexico and Finland, each of which have their own unique visuals and weather effects to contend with. For example, while England is prone to occasional rain, Mexico often finds itself blighted by sandstorms. The weather effects themselves are simple but effective. Rain is simulated by individual pixels gradually appearing on screen to simulate raindrops hitting the windscreen and can subsequently be cleared away with the windscreen wipers, while the sandstorms are simulated with single colour visual noise of varying intensity, hampering your visibility as you drive. The rain in England and the snow in Finland also affect the car's handling, so you'll need to take care to compensate for this. Toyota Celica GT Rally actually holds up surprisingly well today, frame rate aside, and thus I'm pretty confident that I would have had a lot of fun with this game back in the day. With 30 courses to run and the ability to save your best times and progress through the championship to disc, there's a lot to enjoy in it, and I feel that it would have definitely lived up to my expectations as a kid, even knowing the limitations of the hardware that it was running on. So thumbs up for this one. Perhaps not coincidentally, here's another game from Gremlin. This time a somewhat lesser known one that I don't see people mention all that often, but it's one that's stuck in my head over the years. Released in 1992 and developed by Twilight, who had previously worked on several Hanna-Barbera games for High-Tech Software, as well as US Gold's port of Capcom's Mega Twins, Videokid is a peculiar game that presents the aesthetics of a platformer, but actually plays like a scrolling shoot-'em-up. The concept is that our hero, Billy, the titular Videokid, has been sucked into the television after watching an apparently cursed videocassette. Challenged to battle through 5 different video-themed worlds, Billy's future existence depends on his ability to survive the onslaught of incoming enemies and blast his way to victory. Each stage in the game unfolds in an automatically scrolling shoot-'em-up style, though most stages don't just move horizontally or vertically. They tend to change direction throughout, and some offer the opportunity to manually scroll the screen up and down based on Billy's position. Outside of the interesting concept and presentation, it's mostly business as usual in mechanical terms. Billy can power himself up by collecting items, and losing lives will cause him to lose power. Each of the 5 worlds is split into several stages with a boss at the end of each, and each world has a distinct visual theme and selection of weapons available for Billy. One interesting update to the usual shoot-'em-up formula is that one of the power-up items Billy is able to grab allows him to choose how his shots spread out. He has the option of firing both in front and behind him, in both vertical directions as well as straight ahead, and in a diagonal spread in front of him. With the enemies coming from all sides and the scroll direction changing from moment to moment, it can be useful to learn which shot direction is best when, giving the game a little more depth than some other blastathons from the period. Videokid had a somewhat mixed response on its original release. ST Review magazine really didn't like it much, rating it 53% and judging it an unplayable standardised arcade romp ripe for the budget bin, drawing particular criticism to unresponsive controls and the fact that busy levels often meant that it was hard to avoid getting hit. ST Format likewise rated it 59% and noted that, unfortunately, Gremlin have the knack of producing games that are competently programmed and good to look at, but have no spark of gameplay interest to them at all. This is one of them. The game fared better in multi-format and Amiga-centric reviews, with Weekly Games magazine GamesX giving a rating of 4.5 out of 5 to both 16-bit versions, and the One Amiga rating it 82%, branding it professional, playable and unassuming entertainment that doesn't break any new ground. As a kid, I was mostly attracted to Videokid for its aesthetic. Developer Twilight was clearly using similar graphical techniques to those they used for their port of the aforementioned Mega Twins, because multiple reviews commented on the two games' similarity in appearance, and I also often mentally linked the two games together. I did find myself wishing that rather than just looking like a platform game, it actually was a platform game, but having now actually played it, I will concede that the shoot-'em-up approach actually works quite nicely. Part of the appeal of the game is in learning the layout of the levels and how to position yourself to avoid being trapped by the scrolling screen. Thankfully, this isn't entirely trial and error based either. There are plenty of visual cues that you can learn to spot along the way to determine what the safe paths forward might be. Like most ST shoot-'em-ups, Videokid suffers a little in the frame rate department when compared to its Amiga counterpart and similar titles released on console at the time. I disagree with ST Review's assertion that the controls are unresponsive, though the choppy frame rate does make movement look less smooth than it could be. Speaking from a modern perspective, I'd also note that levels packed with enemies that make it hard to progress are clearly a mainstay of the shoot 'em up genre. And since Billy has a life bar rather than suffering one-hit kills in Videokid, he actually has a much easier time than in some of the more unforgiving 90s shoot 'em ups. It would be nice to have some more invincibility frames, or the opportunity to heal though. The question we're considering today though, is whether or not I would have been happy with a copy of this back in the day. And I think I would have been. The visual style is appealing, the varied levels act as a fun incentive to progress, and the game is tough but fair, feeling very much in keeping with other Western developed shoot 'em ups of the era. I would have enjoyed playing this as a kid, so a thumbs up for this one it is too. Wouldn't you know it, it's a third game published by Gremlin. I didn't pick these deliberately, it just so happens that Gremlin happened to put out a lot of games I was particularly interested in back in the day. And if we're being picky, this one was developed by Core Design anyway, though it is worth noting that Simon Phipps, solo creator of the original Switchblade, had nothing to do with this one. Released in 1991, Switchblade II is a platform game that casts players in the role of a descendant of the first game's hero. Also conveniently named Hero, like his predecessor, our hero is tasked with defeating the returned force of evil Havoc, only this time around he doesn't have the titular Switchblade to rely on. He does have a super cool cyber arm that can be loaded with various different types of weapon however, and he also has a pretty badass knife that can do some serious damage, its only real limitation being of course that it must be used in close combat. Switchblade 2, like its predecessor, desperately wishes it was a Japanese game. Once again featuring anime-style character art and a distinctly console-style aesthetic, it absolutely wouldn't have looked out of place on a system like the Mega Drive. This is one of the things that made it enormously appealing to me as a kid. Since I didn't have a Japanese games console at the time, the prospect of being able to play a game that looked like the games that were on those systems was rather exciting. Reviews were solid. ST Format rated it 81%. Despite spending the entire review bitching about how unoriginal platform games were and how little brainpower they required. Very on brand. Atari ST user gave it a generous 90% in a quick shit we forgot to review this roundup, noting that the graphics are at worst excellent and at best absolutely stunning, and that with so much playability it's bound to be big. GamesX gave the ST version a full 5 out of 5, noting that it compared favourably to the Amiga version. I never played the original Switchblade back in the day, so Switchblade 2 was my first contact with the series. Having now played both Switchblade titles, it's not hard to see that the sequel is an indisputably superior game. Abandoning the first Switchblade's incredibly cumbersome charge and release combat system in favour of a simple conventional responsive press fire to attack approach, Switchblade 2 not only looks like a console game, it feels like a console game too. I hasten to add that the original Switchblade is still worthy of a certain amount of respect, not only for being a solo project, but also for being a solid, relatively early take on the open structure exploratory platformer format. Switchblade 2, conversely, is a tad more linear in its progression, though there are sequences in most levels where you can pick one of two routes to take to add a bit of interest. Unlike the first two games we've talked about today, I did actually get the opportunity to play a demo of Switchblade 2 back in the day thanks to ST Action's cover-mounted discs. I was very much taken with it at the time, and exploring the full version today, I definitely feel that I would have enjoyed having this one in my collection. It's a solid platformer with responsive controls, excellent presentation, and some well-designed levels, and it boasts a challenge factor that demands a certain amount of skill, but which isn't absurdly punishing. There are a couple of annoyances that came across from the original Switchblade, most notably traps in the floor that are literally a pixel wide, meaning that you can spot them but you almost certainly won't. But for the most part this is a very good platform game that still holds up well today. It's a pity that the ST version used strange screen-by-screen flick scrolling when moving horizontally despite having perfectly smooth vertical scrolling, something which bugged me back in the day too, but since the game is clearly designed with this in mind, it rarely becomes too much of an issue. From a modern perspective, Switchblade 2 lacks a few convenient features from actual console platformers, such as the ability to manually scroll the screen up or down to see what's ahead, but nothing that makes it unplayable. All in all, it's a very solid game that I would have absolutely loved to have a copy of back in the day. Another thumbs up. We're doing well, aren't we? Spoiler, it's all about to go horribly wrong as we take a look at Emmanuelle, a French adventure game based on the series of erotic movies and books. I'm sure I don't need to tell you what attracted me to this game, although given its release in 1988, I'm not sure that back then I could have adequately expressed what specifically I found interesting about it, particularly given that every single piece of magazine coverage about it was exceedingly coy and embarrassed about even contemplating using the word sex. It has pretty graphics though, and honestly it was as much that as anything that attracted me to the game as the prospect of pixelated nookie. Emmanuelle is one of many games that in the late 80s and early 90s justified the fact that French games were habitually described as weird, because it is a weird game. Part of the problem is that if you just jump into it, you'll have absolutely no clue what in God's name you're supposed to be doing. A little exploration may enable you to determine that you're supposed to be on the trail of the eponymous hottie, but beyond that you're not going to get very far without reading the manual for this one. Actually, reading the manual reveals that your aim is indeed to track down Emmanuelle somewhere in Brazil and give her a good seeing to, but in doing so you must ensure that you obey the 3 laws of eroticism that supposedly Mario will dictate to you.
Mamma mia!
Specifically, you actually need to track down 3 statuettes that symbolise these 3 laws: the law of asymmetry, the law of unusual, and the law of number. Not only that, you have to manage your cash flow, plus your own energy and eroticism levels to ensure that you're fighting fit when the time comes to do the deed. Emmanuelle unfolds as a point-and-click adventure that, unusually for the time, uses a first-person perspective. Simply clicking on things allows you to investigate them. Trouble is, this was an era before we'd figured out the concept of an intelligent responsive cursor, meaning that the hotspots on each screen will be a complete mystery until you've clicked around in the hope of something interesting happening. The game has quite a strong emphasis on interacting with other characters, and this is accomplished through an interface where your character cycles around several thought bubbles of possible things he might want to say, then you click the mouse to say one of them out loud. It's quite an effective interface approach, but the main issue is that every conversation in the game feels like such a sequence of non sequiturs that it's very difficult to make sense of what is supposedly going on. As you might expect from a supposedly erotic game, Emmanuelle provides plenty of opportunity to get it on with various lovely ladies around the environments you explore. Often getting them into bed is a simple case of saying the right thing from the options available, though at first glance there's no discernible benefit to bedding anyone, and in fact sowing too many wild oats will likely leave you too spent to really turn on the erotic charm if you do manage to catch up with Emmanuelle. Reviews at the time seemed mostly bewildered by the game as a whole. The One rated it, of course, 69%, noting that it's better than you might expect, and that compared to similar French comic-style software, Emmanuelle actually works as a game. It's not just junk or just an excuse for dirty pictures. Atari ST user, meanwhile, gave it a rather more mature 60% and noted that graphically the game is quite impressive and there are some good atmospheric pictures, but quality of plot, sound, puzzlement and interaction don't always match up. I'd agree with that assessment. And I think that's the problem. Had I been confronted with this game back in the day, I would have been completely baffled. In 1988, I was 7 years old, and consequently probably would have lacked the social context for what was really going on in the game. But even had I played it a few years later once I was into my teens, I feel I would have still been confused by the disjointed dialogue and unintuitive interactive elements. Since Emmanuelle's release, there are a lot of games that have done exactly what it was trying to do, only much better. Indeed, one can draw some pretty direct comparisons between Emmanuelle and stat-based Japanese dating sims. Today, that makes it an interesting historical curiosity, albeit one you may not want to spend all that much time with. Back in the day, I would have been even more clueless about playing this game than I already was about talking to girls. So a regrettable thumbs down for this one. Finally, we come to Ocean's port of Taito's Chase HQ 2 Special Criminal Investigation, and as I'm sure you can already see from the footage, things aren't going to be pretty from here on. Released in 1990, this was, unsurprisingly, a follow-up to the original Chase HQ, a game that combined vanishing point racing gameplay with vehicular combat as you were tasked with running an increasingly dangerous selection of criminals off the road. Its main addition to its predecessor's formula was the ability to shoot at your target instead of simply having to ram them repeatedly. In theory, this made them easier to take down since you didn't necessarily need to keep pace with them constantly, so long as you could keep them in your sights. In the arcades, the game was a big hit, meaning home conversions were a certainty. And many of those home conversions were well received too. Even this ST version, which managed to obtain a positively glowing 78% assessment from ST Format, who noted that the scrolling is fast and smooth, all the sprites are large and well drawn, and a funky soundtrack plays as you tear along the highway. Only some of these things are true. ST Action meanwhile rated it 68%, noting that the game at times can be quite jerky, the animation can be a little careless, and the car can be very tricky to control, before making the seemingly drunken assertion that if you're a wee toddler you could find it too hard and you may end up hiding it in a cupboard forever, so why fork out a tenner? I don't know. German publication Powerplay gave the harshest review of all, with a score of just 38%, noting that it jerks like the plague and recommended that everyone buy Lotus Turbo Challenge instead. A perfectly reasonable suggestion. I was actually quite surprised at how terrible this conversion is. This is approaching Turbo Outrun levels of bad, and yet I remember reading quite a few fairly positive assessments of it back in the day. And yes, they were specifically referring to the Atari ST version, not the Amiga version. The Amiga version is marginally smoother if you're wondering, but still lags far behind the best 16-bit racers of the period. But would I have enjoyed it back in the day? That's the big question. And when answering that, I should probably admit that despite recognising how terrible it was, I actually played that god-awful version of Turbo Outrun on Atari ST quite a bit in an attempt to pretend that I was playing a real Sega arcade game. As such, I had a certain degree of tolerance for janky, awful racing games, but I still had limits, and I think Chase HQ2's difficulty would have pushed me over the edge. Interestingly, I've subsequently learned that although the Atari ST version of the original Chase HQ is pretty ugly in visual terms, it plays a lot better than this one. I guess that's the one I should have been lusting after all along. How was I to know back then that sequels aren't always improvements on their predecessors? And so we come to the end of this little investigation. 3 out of 5 ain't bad, as they say, so I'm satisfied. In fact, I was genuinely impressed with both Toyota Celica GT Rally and Switchblade II in particular. While recording the footage for each of these, I found myself playing way more of both these games than I really needed to, which I feel speaks volumes. Emmanuelle is a game that I'd actually be interested to take another look at, having read up a little more about how it all works and what you're supposed to be doing, but it's definitely hard to shake the feeling that both adventure games and dating sims were both done far, far better in subsequent years. Chase HQ2, meanwhile, can get right in the bin, but I may take some time to explore the first Chase HQ knowing what I know now. And so, on that note, it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.